Every summer, some bloated superhero franchise underperforms by 30% and the trade press declares the industry in crisis. What those headlines never mention is that one single decade produced financial catastrophes that make modern flops look like minor accounting errors. Studios burn through losses that would dwarf almost anything you would see today, even adjusted for inflation. Films where the budget tripled before a single frame was finished, where over 300 licensed products went unsold, where one production nearly destroyed an entire major studio, and then, almost impossibly, the same studio repeated the mistake 2 years later. Cleopatra, Mutiny on the Bounty, Dr. Dolittle, The Fall of the Roman Empire, these weren't just flops, they were financial extinction events dressed in Technicolor, and the full story is considerably stranger than the headline numbers suggest. Mutiny on the Bounty landed in November 1962 as one of the most anticipated productions MGM had committed to in years, and it promptly became one of the most expensive arguments ever preserved on celluloid. The production in 1962 starred Marlon Brando alongside Trevor Howard and Richard Harris, with MGM's initial budget sitting somewhere between $8 and $10 million. That figure did not survive contact with Brando, and nobody who knew Brando at the time should have been surprised. By the time filming wrapped, the final cost had climbed to $19 million, and against that the film earned $13.7 million domestically, leaving MGM staring at losses of over $6 million in nominal 1962 figures, which translates to roughly $64 million in 2025 terms. You would think a film of that scale, with that cast, filmed on location in Tahiti using a full-size replica ship constructed in Nova Scotia, would at least perform respectably at the box office. It did not, and the reasons were hiding in plain sight throughout production. What makes the Mutiny on the Bounty story genuinely interesting is that the film holds a real piece of cinema history. It was the first motion picture ever shot in the Ultra Panavision 70 widescreen process, a technical achievement that got buried under the avalanche of negative press surrounding Brando's behavior on set. He reportedly rewrote dialogue constantly, refused to follow the script, and made the production essentially uncontrollable. Director Louis Milestone later described Brando's performance as horrible, which is a diplomatically restrained way of summarizing what by all accounts was a 2-year ordeal. The damage to Brando's career took nearly a decade to repair, and it took The Godfather in 1972 to fully reverse it. The strangest footnote involves that Bounty replica itself. The ship survived 50 years after the film's release, outlasting the production's reputation by decades, only to sink during Hurricane Sandy in October 2012 off the coast of North Carolina, with 2 crew members lost. The most durable legacy of a troubled production turned out to be a tragedy with no connection to cinema whatsoever. Cleopatra is the one everyone references, and almost everything the general public believes about it is at least partially wrong. The 1963 production, directed by Joseph L. Mankiewicz, starring Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, and Rex Harrison, has become Hollywood's shorthand for runaway excess, and the reality beneath that reputation is more complicated and considerably more worth examining. Total costs reached $44 million when production and marketing were combined, which represents approximately $463 million in 2025 terms. Taylor's salary alone reached $1 million, making her the first actress in Hollywood history to negotiate a fee at that level, and that figure arrived before the production had even settled on a stable director. Filming began in September 1960 with a $5 million budget. The distance between $5 million and $44 million is what a production looks like when institutional control collapses completely. And Cleopatra lost that control early and never recovered it. Here is the part that usually disappears from the popular version of this story. Cleopatra was actually the highest-grossing film of 1963, earning $57.7 million at the domestic box office alone. The film was not a box office disaster in any conventional sense of the phrase. The problem was purely mathematical. It cost so much to make and market that no realistic level of ticket sales could have covered the gap, and Fox spent 3 additional years collecting residual income before finally breaking even in 1966 when the studio sold the television broadcast rights to ABC for $5 million. 9 Academy Award nominations followed, including Best Picture, and 4 wins covering art direction, cinematography, visual effects, and costume design. The popular myth that Cleopatra forced Fox to sell its backlot, which later became Century City, turns out to be disputed. Variety's own investigation found the studio had sold that land back in 1958, years before Cleopatra went into production, production because television had already carved deeply into their revenues. Fox's actual lifesaver arrived 2 years after Cleopatra's release in the form of The Sound of Music, and what the studio did with the confidence that success generated is where the story takes a genuinely dark turn. The fall of the Roman Empire deserves more attention than it usually receives, partly because it represents the cleanest example of a genuinely good film being destroyed entirely by economics rather than quality. The 1964 production, directed by Anthony Mann and distributed by Paramount, assembled one of the decade's most credible casts, with Sophia Loren, Alec Guinness, James Mason, Stephen Boyd, Christopher Plummer, and Omar Sharif, all appearing together on a budget that reached approximately $19 million. Domestic grosses came in around $4.75 million, producing a shortfall that, according to Variety's 1988 Big Buck scorecard, reached approximately $18.1 million against U.S. rentals, a figure noted here as potentially outdated given the original source. What producer Samuel Bronston built in Las Matas outside Madrid remains one of the more extraordinary physical facts in Hollywood history. The outdoor Roman Forum set covered 92,000 square meters, making it the largest outdoor set ever constructed for a film, and it took 7 months to build before a single day of filming began. Production itself ran for 143 days. A bankruptcy notice published in the New York Times on August 6, 1965, placed the total cost at $18,436,625, which is either meticulous accounting or the kind of precision that only appears once someone is counting losses rather than projecting profits. By June 1964, Bronston Productions had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, reporting over $5.6 million in debts, and in 1971, Bronston himself received a perjury conviction connected to testimony given during those bankruptcy proceedings. The Roman Forum set was demolished after filming. Nothing of it remains. The deeper irony sits in the film's current critical standing. The Fall of the Roman Empire holds a 100% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes today, rated as unusually intelligent for the sword and sandal genre even in contemporary reviews. Its world premiere at the Astoria Theatre in London in March 1964 produced a run of 70 weeks. The film failed not because it was poor work, but because the economics of spectacle filmmaking in the 1960s were structurally broken, and Bronston had positioned himself at the exact center of that broken system. Dr. Dolittle looked like a safe bet from almost every angle Fox could have approached it, which in retrospect is precisely what made it so expensive to get wrong. The 1967 production, directed by Richard Fleischer and starring Rex Harrison, arrived on the back of 2 consecutive Harrison successes, My Fair Lady in 1964 and Cleopatra itself, and Fox approached the project with the specific confidence of a studio that believed it had found a repeatable formula. The original budget was $6 million. By the time production wrapped at Castlecombe in Wiltshire, England, that $6 million had tripled to $18 million, and to break even, the film needed to bring in $31 million at the box office, a figure that in today's money represents something north of $238 million. It brought in $16 million. The gap was irretrievable, and the merchandise situation made it worse in ways that are almost difficult to absorb at face value. Over 300 products were created as part of the licensing campaign, ranging from branded pet food to Mattel talking dolls, and $200 million worth of that merchandise went unsold. Not $40 million, not $80 million, $200 million in Dr. Dolittle branded inventory sitting in warehouses while the film quietly failed to attract audiences willing to sit through it. The production logistics in England created problems nobody had anticipated. Quarantine laws in the United Kingdom prevented the American-trained animals from being brought in, which meant the 1,300 animals used during filming were largely sourced locally and had not been prepared for film work. The result was a production that struggled with its most fundamental practical requirement, while simultaneously burning through money at a pace that should have triggered intervention at the studio level. Fox then ran an aggressive Oscar lobbying campaign for the film, and Dr. Dolittle received a Best Picture nomination at the 1968 Academy Awards, appearing on the shortlist alongside Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. The industry genuinely did not detect the absurdity of that at the time. Rex Harrison's career as a bankable film star effectively ended with Dr. Dolittle, and combined with Warner Brothers' simultaneous failure with Camelot, the production helped dismantle the big-budget family musical as a commercially viable genre. One film, 2 distinct casualties, and a genre that wouldn't recover. The story of Star and Hello Dolly is strange precisely because both films exist as direct consequences of a single miscalculation. That miscalculation has one specific identifiable origin point, and it makes the whole sequence feel almost predetermined. Star, directed by Robert Wise and released in 1968, starred Julie Andrews as stage legend Gertrude Lawrence. It fell approximately $10.8 million short of break-even according to Variety's Big Buck scorecard, a figure flagged as potentially outdated given the 1988 source. Fox's response to the failure was to recut the film and re-release it under the title Those Were the Happy Times, a rebranding strategy that performed with the same energy as rearranging furniture during a structural fire. It failed again under the new title with the same film inside. Hello Dolly, directed by Gene Kelly and released in 1969, starred Barbra Streisand and Walter Matthau and carried a $25 million production budget while grossing approximately $33 million at the box office. Broadway producer David Merrick held a contractual clause preventing any film release until the stage show's Broadway run concluded, forcing Fox to delay the release and accumulate costs in the meantime. The studio would not recover from the sequence of musical disasters until a successful theatrical reissue of The Sound of Music in early 1973, which meant years of financial pressure stemming from decisions made in a window of misplaced confidence. The hidden connection between all of these failures runs directly through one director. Robert Wise made The Sound of Music in 1965, a film that rescued Fox from the Cleopatra losses and generated enough profit to convince every major studio that the big-budget musical was the most reliable product in the industry. 3 years later, Wise directed Star, which became one of the worst casualties of exactly the overconfidence his earlier success had produced. The same director whose hit had triggered the boom stood in the wreckage of the bust he had accidentally helped to create. That is not irony as a figure of speech, that is just the specific mechanical way that Hollywood has always worked. By 1968, Variety had investigated and found that the last 4 pictures of every major star earning $250,000 or more per film had collectively failed at the box office, and average budgets had climbed to $3 or $4 million before marketing costs were added, meaning most productions needed north of $10 million globally just to reach zero. Fox invested $434 million across 107 films during the 1960s as a whole, and without The Sound of Music and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the studio would have posted an overall loss for the entire decade. The lesson the industry absorbed from all of this is the same lesson it forgets on roughly a 20-year cycle. Scale is not a strategy. A larger set does not guarantee a larger audience, and a bigger star does not guarantee a proportional return. The 1960s studios absorbed this at extraordinary cost, then passed the bill to shareholders, creditors, and in Bronston's case, a federal court. Modern studios have access to all of this history, decades of documented evidence, and sophisticated data from 100 streaming platforms, and they still occasionally greenlight a $200 million production that opens to $40 million on its first weekend and calls the result a surprise. The pattern of spending beyond rational limits and then expressing institutional shock at the outcome has repeated across every decade since. The history of studios building empires on borrowed confidence, then watching those empires collapse in slow motion is exactly what this channel keeps digging into, and if that kind of story holds your attention, you are already in the right place.